Imagine a poet shrouded in mystery, whose very existence is in doubt. His tales of war, gods, and heroes glorify violence and reinforce patriarchal norms, where women are mere shadows of men and glory is born of bloodshed. Yet these stories have shaped Western literature for over 2,700 years and are still taught in schools around the world, despite their outdated values. Why are they still taught? Why hasn't it been taken up by feminists? Today we will talk about Homer. Chapter 1. The main reasons why people still remember him. Who is Homer? Imagine the shore of the clear Aegean Sea, where thousands of years ago people gathered, warriors, traders, poets. Among them sat an unfamiliar singer, tall or short. No one knows what he looked like. Whether he was from Chios or Smyrna is also a moot point. And yet his voice has come down through the ages. Why? As always, the reasons are complex. There are personal qualities of the hero, the era in which he was born, social connections, and luck. Let's take a closer look. Homer is a legendary ancient Greek epic poet of the 8th century BC, whose immortal voice from the shores of the Aegean Sea gave the world the Iliad and the Odyssey, powerful stories about heroes and gods woven into a dactylic hexameter that still captivates listeners today with its drama, wisdom, and the unchanging power of words. His mysterious personality has become a symbol of the oral tradition that gave birth to European literature and gave impetus to culture, standing at the root of all the great epic narratives of mankind. One of the reasons why he stood out among the hundreds and thousands of other sages, writers, and artists of his era was his incredible talent. He was a poetic genius of his time. Homer mastered the ancient Greek language with the same skill as a sculptor with stone. He put in each line the perfect size of a dactylic hexameter, a metric pattern that resembles a heartbeat. It was this rhythm that helped the listener memorize thousands of lines of poetry without any notes. His poet's memory resembles the modern method of the mnemonic palace. Each scene of the Iliad and Odyssey was recorded in the imagination of each listener like a movie frame. The historical context was also included. The difference between a novel and an epic is that an epic describes the culminating, revolutionary, and most important events of world history. Those events that changed the course of history into before and after. Homer wrote epics, and he wrote them because he was born in such a historical time. In his Iliad, he described the greatest war in human history. As of the 8th century BC, of course, the events of the Iliad, the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, resonated as vividly in the hearts of the first listeners as the stories of the world wars of the 20th century do for us today. The myth of the lost kingdom, heroic deeds, and the wrath of the gods sounded terribly modern. Every community saw in it its own reflection, the struggle for honor, for home, for a beloved. Homer managed to combine in one work almost all the classical themes that people describe in millions of variations to this day. Love and betrayal, friendship and revenge, the way home and the encounter with a lost life, all the great questions of existence are addressed in his poems. When Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, confronts the monster Cyclops, and at the same time grieves for his wife Penelope, he personifies each of us who is looking for a home and realizes the value of life. Homer lived in a favorable civilizational time to become great. Around the 8th century BC, a new type of organization was formed in Greece, the polis, city-state, and they were looking for a common identity, common holidays, a common language, a common myth. During sacred gatherings and sports games, for example, at the Corinthian and Olympic Games, his poems were performed endlessly, emphasizing, "We are the descendants of the heroes of Troy." It was during these critical times for Greek identity that Homer's works were imagined as a collection of our entire history. That is, it was at that time that public identity began to emerge. It was on an evolutionary scale. And who knows what civilization would have been like if this identity had been prescribed by someone other than Homer. That era was also unique in the cultural context. It was a successful transition from oral tradition to writing. Although the Iliad and the Odyssey were originally transmitted by Raphic singers, reciters, around the 7th century BCE they began to be written on parchment and clay tablets. The poet, even if unknown, was written down forever. It was a transition from the fragile hearth of oral storytelling to a manuscript that could survive fires, wars, and centuries. Ancient Venetian merchants, then Roman elites, and later Byzantine monks all considered Homer the foundation of education and sent lists of his works to each other. Subsequently, Arab scholars translated fragments of the Odyssey, and Renaissance humanists introduced it into university programs. Each new elite found something different in his words, and so Homer, like a train passenger, traveled around the world. Ancient Venetian merchants, then Roman elites, and later Byzantine monks all considered Homer to be the foundation of education and sent lists of his works to each other. Subsequently, Arab scholars translated fragments of the Odyssey, and Renaissance humanists introduced it into university programs. Each new elite found something different in his words, and so Homer, like a train passenger, traveled around the world. The philosophers of classical Greece from Plato to Aristotle cited his traces in every moment of culture. The concept of zero in poetry, the structure of action broken in tragedies. When Aristotle spoke of the obligatory elements of a story, he was relying on the Homeric model. From Dante to Tolkien, from Jules Verne to the book writers of the 21st century, all great storytellers feel that their literary pillar is in the column of Homer. And when we return to the myth today, we once again confirm that the quality of the main story sets the standard for all the subsequent ones. Thus, Homer's personality combined everything. The combination of internal factors, genius, unsurpassed memory, universality of themes, and external circumstances, maturity of the polis culture, the emergence of writing, patrons, and the moment of public success, made Homer not just another author, but an immortal symbol of the epic. That is why we, his contemporaries, keep coming back to his poems, reading them, adapting them, and listening to them at bedtime, in the gym, or while driving, because in the pacing of each line, we hear our own search for meaning in home. Chapter 2. Interesting facts about Homer. 1. Blind genius or literary myth. Many medieval monks and Renaissance humanists believe that Homer was blind. That's why he was depicted with a blindfold, because hearing and voice were his main tools. Modern researchers consider this an artistic device. Blindness emphasizes the supernatural gift of the poet who sees the world not with his eyes but with his imagination. 2. Where and when Homer was born is still unknown. Smyrna, Chios, Colophon all claim to be the poet's hometown. Imagine a dispute that has been going on for more than 2 millennia. If Homer lived today, his place of birth will become a meme on social media. 3. An explosive mix of war and love. The Iliad and the Odyssey combine 2 super powerful themes. Heroic battles. Here we can draw parallels with the Trojan War, a conflict between the Greeks and the Trojans over the abduction of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, and tender longing for his wife. Odysseus wanders the seas for several years to return to Penelope. It was this clash of cruelty and romance that made his epics universal. 4. The musical basis of the word. The dactylic hexameter in which his poems are written is 6-dimensional beats per line, like the rhythm of a march, and at the same time a heartbeat. Imagine you are sitting by the fire, someone speaks quietly and simultaneously strikes the strings of a lyre. This is how the words come to life. 5. Sharp social satire. In Homer's poems, one can find mocking portraits of petty swindlers, supporters of easy enrichment, and participants in the black market in ancient Greece. For example, in the Odyssey, there is an episode with a merchant who deceives sailors by selling magic grapes. Today, we would call this a pseudoscientific supplement. 6. An unknown group or a lone artist. Some scholars believe that Homer is not a single person, but collective pseudonym for a generation of traveling singers who created epic narratives over the centuries. The perfectly retouched texts of the Iliad and the Odyssey could be the result of the work of an entire editor in the later period. 7. Prophetic lights and radioactivity. Some verses of the Iliad describe phenomena that modern scientists compare to the brilliance of an atomic explosion, bright flashes, and a dark column of smoke on the horizon. Does it sound like science fiction? Perhaps it is just an epic description of a battle, or perhaps a collective memory of natural disasters. 8. Lustful adult insertions. Did you notice the subtle hint of human weakness in the scene with the goddess Aphrodite? Some lines have slight erotic connotation, for example, references to burning hearts and lustful passion, which Roman censors were later forced to censor. In the Odyssey and the Iliad, Homer occasionally allows himself vivid, even slightly inflammatory descriptions of the body and feelings, and when the texts found their way into schools and public readings in Rome, some of these radically lively images were muted. Even in ancient Rome, Homer's epic might have seemed too explicit, so the lustful lines were adjusted to a restrained manner, from the shine of the moon, instead of a naked roundness, to analogies with dry ticks, instead of erotic hints. It is these inclusions of living flesh and feelings that make Homer not just a teacher of heroics, but a poet capable of awakening the deepest human emotions in his listeners. 9. The eternal revolution of plots. The plot of the Odyssey, about a cunning traveler who deceives giants and gods, inspired Dante in the Divine Comedy, Jules Verne in The Matter of the 5 Points, and even the author of Game of Thrones, George Martin. Each new writer steals a bit of Homer's idea, proving this story never gets old. 10. The poet without a grave. According to legend, Homer never had a decent burial. His grave was searched for in Smyrna, Rhodes, and Chios, but never found. This gives the poet an aura of mysticism. It is as if he is still wandering the shores of Evia, looking for his next audience. These facts are a colorful cocktail of truth and legend, of sharp social hints and mysterious archaic images. It is these facts that turn Homer from an ancient author into a living voice that has not ceased to speak for almost 3,000 years. Chapter 3. His contribution to culture and civilization as a whole. We will present this section in chronological order. 1. Archaic Greece, 8 to 6 centuries BC. Oral poetic tradition. Homer laid down the canon of the ancient Greek heroic epic, meter, dactylic hexameter, formulaic epithets, and epic stamps that made it possible to memorize and reproduce thousands of lines without writing. Social context. The poems were performed at public gatherings, festivals, and competitions of the polities, from the Olympic Games to sacrificial feasts. 2. Hellenistic period and the Alexandrian school, 3 to 2 centuries BC. Critical edition. The chief Homerologist Aristarchus of Samos created the first canonical edition of the Iliad and the Odyssey, introducing a system of marks, asterisk, to indicate disputed lines and corrections of the text. Lexicography. Aristarchus' predecessors, e.g. Philetus of Kos, collected Homer's rare words, so dictionaries and interpretations of Homeric forms were already available in the middle of the 2nd century BC. 3. Roman Empire, I century BC v century AD. Ideology of power. The Emperor Augustus used the Alexandrian text of Homer as a golden model for the formation of a new cultural policy of Rome. Unlike the Republican tradition, he promoted the image of his own powerful hero in the manner of Achilles or Odysseus. Education and literature. Homer became an obligatory component of grammar schools and rhetorical exercises. Students were taught to interpret heroic stories as examples of valor, morality, and state wisdom. 4. Early Christianity and Byzantium, 2-6 centuries AD. Allegorical reading. The Church allowed pagan texts, interpreting them as moral teaching under the cover of myth. Clement of Alexandria and Origen turned to Homer to demonstrate spiritual and moral lessons, looking for prototypes of Christian virtues in epic images. Manuscript preservation. Byzantine monasteries copied the Homeric codices, including the famous Venetus A, which provided the basis for their further transmission to Western Europe. 5. The Islamic world, 8x centuries. Greek-Arabic translation movement. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom translated from Greek not only scientific treatises but also fragments of epic poetry. Although direct full Arabic translations of Homer were rare, his rhetoric and poetic techniques influenced the Arabic epic tradition. Later translations. In the 19th century, Sulayman al-Bastani created a versified Arabic translation of the Iliad, which consolidated Homer's status as the king of poets in the Arab cultural circle. 6. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Western Renaissance. The first Greek manuscripts appeared in Italy thanks to the translator Manuel Chrysoloras, late 14th century, and the printed Homer, based on the text of the Venice manuscript, was published in Florence in 1488. Literary influence. Dante in his Divine Comedy calls Homer the sovereign of poets, and Shakespeare and Virgil also borrowed Homeric motifs of heroism and moral choice. 7. Enlightenment, 17 to 18 centuries. Criticism and philology. The science of comparative linguistics and textual studies was born. European scholars, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau to Helder, studied Homer's natural national poetry as a key to understanding the national spirit and culture. A modernity and academic study. University courses. For example, Stanford Classics 217, The Language of Homer, includes 3 to 5 credits. Intensive reading and phonology of Homeric Greek is almost equal to 45-75 hours of lectures per semester, and Classics 13G Intermediate Greek, Homer's Iliad, 5 credits, almost equals 75 hours of classroom work. Harvard Extension School, CGRK E31 Homer's Odyssey, 4 credits, almost equals 48 hours of lectures and discussions. Practical application of Homer's works in the modern world. Mnemonics. Memory researchers study Homer's poetic memory techniques to develop modern methods of memorization, mnemonic palaces. Narrative therapy and cinema. Screenwriters and writers adapt the Homeric structure of the hero's journey as a universal story framework. Leadership. Academic management courses cite the images of Achilles and Odysseus as examples of moral strength and strategic thinking in conflict. Together, from the epic's origins and oral tradition to today's lectures at the most prestigious universities, Homer's legacy has consistently shaped world culture, science, and education and continues to live on in our stories, words, and imaginations. Chapter 4. 10 Homeric ideas that turned out to be false or even absurd in the framework of modern evidence-based science. 1. Fatalism as the main engine of the plot. Homer depicts a world where fate is unshakable. Everything that has to happen from Patroclus' death to Odysseus' return has already been decided by the gods. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, categorically refutes this approach. Belief in fatalism creates passivity, a sense of hopelessness, and a performer mentality, while research shows that we are able to actively influence and change our lives through our own actions and decision-making. 2. Divine intervention instead of rational explanation. In the Homeric poems, any miracle is explained by the hand of Zeus or the intricate plan of Athena. Modern science replaces these causes with evidence-based models. Epidemics are explained by bacteria and viruses, and natural disasters by geophysical processes. In an epic work, thunder from the wrath of gods sounds great, but disaster statistics and seismology give us realistic forecasts and prevention mechanisms. 3. Epic idealization of anger. Achilles deploys his uncontrollable anger as the main driver of events, and it seems to motivate the hero. CBT considers anger to be an unhelpful emotion in the long run. It disrupts thinking, overestimates the risk of impulsive decisions, and damages relationships. Evidence-based emotional regulation programs teach how to control anger through conscious breathing, reprogramming thought patterns, and assertiveness skills. 4. The path of glory through bloodshed. Homer's heroes believe that the only virtue is glory on the battlefield. Today, sociology and psychology are pushing to rethink military victories. True human resilience is measured not in hectares of conquered land, but in the ability to build healthy communities, support families, and contribute to the well-being of others. 5. Gender inequality as a divine order. Women in the Homeric world are mostly secondary figures. Penelope waits, Cassandra prophesies, Aphrodite seduces. Modern research on gender equality shows that stereotypes limit the development of both men and women, for example, in work, leadership, and education. The idea of natural subordination is not only false, but also harmful to personal growth. 6. The one hero, one salvation fallacy. Homer's works personify salvation in the figure of one genius leader, Achilles, Odysseus. Modern team-based management models and collective intelligence prove that success is achieved through the coordinated work of a group, a variety of ideas, and mutual support, not just a phenomenal individual. 7. Belief in magic objects. The invincible shield of Achilles or the burning leaf of Athena are classics. Today, we realize that technology and engineering achievements have nothing to do with magic. Shields and armor are designed based on the physical properties of metals and aerodynamics. 8. The stereotype of strong is brave versus emotional flexibility. Strong men in the epic ignore pain and tears because it is not manly. CBT and the modern psychology of emotions prove that healthy expression of vulnerability promotes deep self-awareness, effective cooperation, and strong relationships. 9. Punishment through humiliation. When heroes betray or violate the sacred law of hospitality, they are threatened with public humiliation or death without trial. Modern criminology condemns such approaches as inhumane and ineffective. Humane justice, rehabilitation, and restorative practices have been shown to reduce recidivism and create a safer society. 10. The ideal of unconditional loyalty. Fighting, sacrifice, and suffering for honor, even if the leader is unjust. Today, we realize that critical thinking and the willingness to question the decisions of the authorities are the key to the development of a healthy political and social environment. These Homeric ideas are great dramatic techniques for an epic, but in real life they lead to emotional burnout, stereotypes, and even social injustice. Modern CBT and social sciences offer us other, more flexible models: active problem solving, empathy, collectivism, and rational thinking. Chapter 5. The political and ideological views of Homer. Let's imagine Greece in the 8th century BC, a set of polises, city-states, where power was still being formed: a king for life, Basilius; a council of elders, Gerousia; and a popular assembly, ecclesia, worked closely together. It was in this world that the voice of Homer was born, who did not declare his own political program, but transmitted the powerful ideological codes of his time through heroes and myths. Although the poems honor the people's assembly and the decisions of the councils, the main heroic ideal is the tribal nobility. Achilles, Agamemnon, and Menelaus are all of aristocratic origin, fighting for the honor of their family and community. Homer emphasizes that they have the right to lead the people into battle. This corresponds to the modern notion of elitism, the power of a select narrow circle of the best by origin and connections. In the Iliad, King Agamemnon behaves as an absolute ruler, but he always consults with the Achaean council, an element of consensus. Ideologically, this resembles modern constitutional monarchies, where the king or president has considerable authority, but there are limitations through advisory bodies. Despite the fact that Homer's world is divided into tribes, Achaeans, Dacians, Thebans, the idea of Greek solidarity against the barbars, Trojans, sounds vivid, the first attempt to create a united identity. It is similar to modern nationalism, but with strong tribal features. In each polis, there were disputes between the old families and the newly arrived elites, for example, Ionians versus Dorians. In the poems, this is reflected in the tension between Achilles and Agamemnon. The former is the son of a priest, the defender of the national spirit, and the latter is an ancient royal family from the Panhellenic tribes. Homer respects the authority of the gods Zeus, Athena, and teaches that a ruler should be a fighter for justice who receives his mandate from above. Today, this resembles the divine right of kings popular in European Middle Ages, but without the explicit theocracy. If we imagine where Homer would be on today's left-right and authoritarian liberal scale, he would be in favor. For economic elitism, support for noble clans and hereditary power is far from socialism, closer to conservative capitalism with an emphasis on hereditary privilege. Among political regimes, he would have chosen rather an authoritarian conservative one with a belief in a strong leader, but not denying the advisory councils of elites. Homer would also have been a strong individualist. Heroic glory is achieved through individual feats, but always in the context of a tribe or polis, hence the combination of individual responsibility with collective loyalty. He favored the preservation of traditions and the status quo, but realized the value of popular unity and civic participation. Homer wrote in the distant archaic times, around the 8th century BC, when the first urban communities polises were just beginning to emerge in Greece. At that time, there was no developed political system in the modern sense. There was no socialism with its ideas of joint distribution of resources, no democratic elections based on the model of the Athenian assembly, and even less feminist movements or woke culture. The political and social structure was built on the basis of kinship, the honorable status of the aristocracy, and the direct participation of male citizens in important assemblies, while the rights of women and slaves remained almost beyond discussion. Such discussions would only emerge for the first time 500 years later in the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In such a world, the epic poems the Iliad and the Odyssey served as a kind of social glue. They reinforced ideas about heroic virtues, tribal solidarity, and divine order, rather than individual civil rights or social interest groups. The polities were still considering how to balance the power of the king and the popular assembly, and a broader dialogue about gender equality, economic justice, or minority rights would not emerge for thousands of years, so any modern political or ideological categories are completely inappropriate for the Homeric era. Chapter 6. How did he treat women, and what did he say about them? The personal life of Homer himself is lost in legend. Know almost nothing about his family, wife, or children. According to some speculations, Homer could be a collective image or a pseudonym of several traveling singers, so there is no point in talking about a specific family. Neither the Iliad nor the Odyssey contain a single line such as Homer and his daughters, or Homer teaches his son. Accordingly, we cannot say whether he had children and how he brought them up. In Homer's poems, women usually appear in two roles, as keepers of the home, Penelope, Antigone, or as powerful deities, Athena, Aphrodite. A positive example is Penelope, a wise and faithful wife who waits for Odysseus to return for 20 years, manages the household, and reflects the ideal of a faithful wife. On the other hand, the images of human women are often quite stereotypical. They are portrayed as emotional, sometimes manipulative, Cassandra, Circe, or as temptation, Helen of Troy. On the one hand, there is no hint of true gender equality in his work. Most decisions are made by men, and women are secondary characters. On the other hand, his work perfectly demonstrates that stereotyping and objectification of the female body existed even 3,000 years ago. Women were primarily evaluated for their appearance, and their other qualities were secondary. Also, Homer's works perfectly demonstrate that women even 3,000 years ago used their feminine techniques, manipulations, pretended to be stupid when it was beneficial for them, and did everything that modern women do. They just didn't have Instagram, and the technology was different. If we were to evaluate Homer's world on a scale from 0 to 100, with 0 being radical feminism and 100 being traditional patriarchy in the style of Andrew Tate, his attitude towards women would be close to 70 to 80 points. He respectfully portrays the strength and wisdom of individual female characters, but at the same time believes that real power and initiative belong to male characters. Contemporary radical feminists will certainly disapprove of the lack of female autonomy in his poems, while supporters of rigid traditional roles, similar to those of Andrew Tate, will feel more theirs in Homer's ethics. Homer has become a kind of architect of gender concepts in Western culture. His poems lay down the idea that women are primarily the keepers of the home and objects of temptation, for example, through the images of Penelope or Helen of Troy. And men are primarily virile alphas and wise men who know everything, for example, through the hypertrophied images of Achilles and Odysseus. A few centuries later, Aristotle, who himself had clearly patriarchal views in his philosophy, cited Homer's ideas as authoritative evidence of women's natural weakness. Later, medieval schools taught according to Aristotle, and in turn, they were based on the Homeric tradition, so the stereotype of women's emotionality and dependence was passed down from generation to generation, like a genetic code of culture. It was only in the XXXXI centuries, thanks to the development of cognitive psychology and neuroscience, that scientists were able to look into the depths of the human psyche and brain. Previously, any differences between the sexes were explained by the natural order or divine will, but now we have MRI data and large-scale meta-analyses. For example, a recent study by Stanford University found that while an AI algorithm can reliably classify male and female brain scans, the brain itself is remarkably plastic and shaped by culture and experience, not just gender. Another study using diffusion tensor imaging in 949 participants found that men have slightly higher intrahemispheric and women have slightly higher interhemispheric inactivity, but these differences are too small to correlate unambiguously with behavior. Social factors, culture, and life circumstances play a much larger role. There are still differences in some metrics. For example, on average, women show better results in verbal episodic memory and information processing speed, and men are traditionally better at navigation and spatial thinking. However, these differences are not critical and have a statistical rather than a causal relationship, and the differences between men and women in most cognitive areas are insignificant. In any case, individual differences are many times larger than intergroup differences. Returning to Homer, it should be recognized that Homer did not invent the norms he described in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He described the reality of an archaic society where the division of labor and power was clearly expressed and usually passed down through tribal laws. But thanks to the epic hypertext, majestic metrics, images, and formulaic epithets, this description became not just a reflection but also a symbol of the ideal norm. The combination of real social roles and the artistic emphasis on their significance created a strong meme of generations. Reality-inspired art, art-inspired society. And so this patriarchal scenario was fixed in culture for millennia to come. Chapter 7. Generation of Artificial Intelligence. Who would Homer be in the 21st century? Let's imagine that we are transporting Homer from the 8th century BC right into the modern world. His brilliant memory, command of words, and talent as a storyteller would immediately make him a universal media artist. However, the path to recognition would have started with a rather modest start. 1. Where did he start and how did he pave his way to the top? Origin. In the Homeric tradition, he was first an unnamed singer with limited resources, a slave or servant to some wealthy patron. A modern analog is a guy from the provinces or a small town who works at a low-paying job, bartender, courier, coffee shop assistant, but runs a TikTok page or a podcast in the evenings. The first followers and the first popularity. Just as raffia singers used to share their polys in circles, Homer would now join co-working spaces for content creators, attend literary slams and crossover podcasts, where he would present short promotional versions of epic stories. Gradually, he would be noticed by production studios and literary agencies. 2. Occupation and income. The main direction is a multimedia storyteller. According to modern analogies, Homer would have become a famous podcaster lit creator, combining long-form audio podcast with animated 2D video series. He would release the Homeric Legends series on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Monetization. 1. Advertising and sponsorship integrations, YouTube AdSense, dynamic inserts in Spotify, monthly income of about $10,000 to $15,000 at the start. 2. Patrons and donors, a loyal audience donates another $5,000 to $10,000 monthly through Patreon. 3. Books and merchandise, bright Homeric quotes on sweatshirts, t-shirts, and collectible artworks are distributed among antiquity lovers, another $20,000 to $30,000 per month. The total annual earnings in the 2-3 RD year of active work are about $200,000 to $300,000, which corresponds to a mid-level successful content maker or niche YouTuber. 3. Social networks and audience. YouTube, 500,000 subscribers with an average view of 200,000 per video. Instagram, 150,000 followers, short carousels with Homeric memes, fact of the day videos. TikTok, 300,000 followers, dynamic 60-second versions of Homeric myths with sound design. Paid newsletter, 20,000 subscribers receive weekly in-depth analyses of topics with Q&A. Audience, educated young people aged 18 to 35, teachers, humanities students, military personnel, fans of podcasts and alternative edutainment. 4. An analogy with antiquity, from a slave to an iconic figure. Slave in antiquity, freelancer startup. Homer starts without his own resources, but thanks to his talent, he gains patrons. In the 21st century, these would be the first angel investors of a podcast studio startup who saw the potential in unique content. Becomes a classic. Years later, his series are included in university playlists and OC world literature courses. His quotes are published in school textbooks on ancient history. 5. Views on contemporary social and political topics. Social justice. Admiring the heroic impulses in the Iliad, the modern Homer will defend Columbia-style civic engagement, support for public initiatives, equal access to education and culture. Immigration and refugees. Remembering Odysseus, who was looking for a home for a long time, he sympathizes with those who were forced to flee by boat, calling for humane policies towards refugees. Ecology. From the favorite theme of the spirit of place, topos of Homer's world, he makes a message about the protection of cultural landscapes and the preservation of historical ruins. As for his political beliefs, it is almost impossible to predict. Rather, it is a story about how cultural and social circumstances sometimes influence people more than the natural essence of a person. Homer lived so long ago, and in such an archaic society that he had never even heard of such words as social democracy. That is, it is very likely that if he had been born in a traditionally Republican state in the appropriate environment, he would have been a Republican. And if he had been born in a Democratic environment, he would have been more likely to be a Democrat. To a large extent, a person's worldview depends on his or her location. This is the kind of character Homer was. On the one hand, was he great? Certainly. He and his influence on the history and culture of mankind were great. On the other hand, it is not known for certain whether he even existed. Was he one particular person or a collective image of many authors shrouded in legends? It is not known for sure. If you are interested in learning about other interesting characters and other interesting stories, don't forget to subscribe and like us. This will help in the development of the channel. For my part, I will try to make the content interesting and useful. It will be convenient to listen to before going to bed, while working out, or cooking. See you soon.